introduce to you who have not met him before, Mark Trahant, who does a lot of things in journalism, in public history, in advocacy for journalists, but is first and foremost a storyteller. And as Rodney mentioned, Mark has an association with the School of Journalism and Mass Media. This is his third semester as what we call an editor-in-residence. He has previously taught a course in conjunction with the 2010 Boris Symposium on social media and democracy. Last year he taught opinion writing and an American Studies course on the American West. And this semester he is teaching social media for journalists, and his students are here and they are live tweeting this program as a class assignment. I didn't intend to mention Mark's books because you can go to Amazon.com and put in his name and you'll get a whole rundown. But being here in this room with this magnificent sculpture of the salmon migrating upstream prompts me to mention one of his books is called The Whole Salmon, which was published by Idaho's Sun Valley Center for the Arts. And another piece of his writing is an essay that is provocatively titled, Who's Your Daddy? In a book called Lewis and Clark Through Indian Eyes, an anthology edited by the late Alvin Josephi Jr. He also writes news poems on Twitter, which are 4-line rhymes based on current news events under the handle News Rhymes 4 Lines. And if you, again, do Mark Trahant Twitter Poet, you can get the most recent poems, including an observation on the current Secret Service sex scandal. So he's staying current with that. Mark is a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe of Idaho and a former president of the Native American Journalists Association. His most recent project is for the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. It started off as an oral history project in which he was interviewing key figures from the 1970s and the administration of President Richard Nixon. The Smithsonian has since decided to make this a full project, probably a museum exhibit and a film. And Mark's role in this project is as principal investigator. Sounds like a bit of a history detective. Mike and his wife Lenora have 2 sons, Marvin, who is a sophomore here at the U of I, studying broadcasting and digital media, and Elias, who is a junior at Highland High School in Pocatello. And the family lives in Fort Hall, Idaho. Earlier this year, Mark received a month-long residency from the Rockefeller Foundation in Bellagio, Italy. And Mark is modest and is not prone to dropping names, but I should mention that one of his companions in this recent residency was Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who was a Boris Symposium speaker several years ago. So that's the circle that Mark has been traveling with recently. While at Bellagio, Mark started and wrote 4 chapters of a book about austerity. And this is a topic he will explore tonight in a talk titled The Full Spectrum in a Wheel, Less, More, and the Opposite Spoke. Please join me in giving a warm vandal welcome to Mark Trahant.
Thank you, Kenton. Thank you, Kenton. Being that I'm always experimenting with technology, tonight I'm experimenting with a new one. There's this really nifty app that is a teleprompter for your iPad, and so I'm trying that. Thank you for having me here tonight. It's just always just wonderful to be on the campus of the University of Idaho. And I also wanted to say up front that I really like the metaphor of turning of the wheel, and it's appropriate for what I have to say. The image of the wheel, of course, is something found in just about every tribal culture outside of the idea, outside of our spoke, is a reminder of the world beyond. And the wheel itself is just a great metaphor for the cycle of life. So if we live in a world of more, then the other side, the opposite spoke, is the world of less. 3 years ago, my life changed dramatically when the Hearst Corporation ended the publication of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. I was thrust into one of those new spokes, one with no job. My son even today likes to joke, my younger son, that I'm the busiest unemployed guy in the world. But it was also this really great opportunity because I could do anything I wanted. I had this blank sheet of paper in front of me, which for a writer is just about the absolute ideal. Think about those moments in history when our ancestors crossed a boundary and entered a different spoke in the wheel. My great-grandfather was born the same year the Fort Peck Indian Reservation was established in northern Montana. He grew up, and my grandmother grew up, in a new spoke of the wheel, a life that was nearly opposite in every way to their parents' and grandparents' lives. Talk about a radical change. As a young man, my great-grandfather went on a trip to Washington, D.C. The year was 1909. My grandmother had a picture that she used to show me of her father dressed in a dapper three-piece suit standing on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. My grandmother used to love telling stories about going away to boarding school and growing up in that home. These days, that's not often seen as a positive experience, but for my grandmother, it definitely was. Her family's house near Fraser, Montana, was a busy place. People would visit her father and bring their problems day or night. He would feed them, listen to them, and try to help. For my grandmother, this meant a lot of hard work because she was always cleaning or cooking or doing something to support that lifestyle of leadership. And so for her, boarding school was actually a relief, almost a lark. One of her favorite stories was about the packages she would receive from home when she was at Haskell Indian Institute in Kansas. From time to time, her family would send a box full of jam, dried meat, and sometimes a few dollars. My grandmother laughed at this point when she'd tell the story because then she would add she'd immediately blow the loot. She'd consume all the goodies instantly until they were gone. Her sister, however, was more careful. She would dole out the treasures slowly. She would open a package, take a small bite, and wrap the rest for later. Every morsel was to be saved for as long as possible. Of course, she had to contend with her sister, my grandmother, who would start begging for either remaining cash or any other goodie that was still in the box. I always loved this story as a kid because it was a window into my grandmother's youthful character and how she evolved, crossing a boundary I never knew. I never knew her as the wild spender, only as a woman who would carefully wrap extra food from a restaurant in a bag, a box, or even a napkin, because she'd always say with a smile, "I have a lot of grandchildren." This is the same grandmother who told me about living during the Depression on $1 a day and living in a railroad boxcar because, she said, it was way better than living with his mother. I have a reason for telling this story now. I think we're at a point where it's time to rethink our stories that fit with our times. The stories we tell matter because, as I see it, we are at the beginning of two challenges that rival any of those faced by our ancestors. The first challenge is a demographic upheaval on a massive scale, and the second is climate shock. The result is that we will live in a world of less. We will have less than our parents. And just what is less? Less stuff, smaller houses, consuming less materials and energy, just less. And our children, they will have even less. I can hear maybe not laughter, but curiosity about this. The notion of reducing consumption in the West is not a new idea. There is no way that Americans would ever slow their spending, stop building larger houses, or simply reduce energy use. Except it's already happening. American consumers spent less in 2010 than they did in 2009, and on just about everything in the household budget. Spending by the average person dropped 2% overall. Entertainment spending, a category that's often thought of as just an optional purchase, dropped 7% last year, the most in any consumer category. Other declines: food spending down 3.8%, consumers spent nearly 7% less going out to dinner, mortgage interest and payments dropped 6.8%. Just what we need, more evidence of a continued weakness in the housing market. And since 2007, in a straight trajectory, consumer mortgage credit has dropped by 13%. But do these numbers really represent a shift in a longer story arc? That's where I think demographics play a role. And consider the demographic imbalance in the Western world. It means that many of us are older, and we require significant resources at the very moment when governments are stretched beyond their ability to deliver services. This imbalance is so great that it stirs a threat of a new kind of civil war, not one based on borders or ideology, but a war for resources based on our age. The increasing number of older people represents a challenge to any society, but it's not just that there are more of us, it's that there are more of us living longer. In the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Canada, Japan, the trend of living longer is increasing. Today, 1 in 10 people globally are over 60 years old. 40 years from now, that number will be 1 in 5. By then, people over 60 will outnumber children. Think about this in the context of work or poverty, or how governments aggressively insist on austerity measures that pit one generation against another. The thing about demographics is that these trends are already cast in a concrete that's quickly drying. There's nothing we can do at this point to break the mold. Our smartest option is to figure out how to live in that world of imbalance, a world requiring a new kind of austerity, a world of less. One of the complications in this is that while we in Europe and the United States are growing older, there is another demographic countertrend, a rapid population expansion. But practically all of that growth is occurring in poor countries. For the first time in history, more people now live in cities than do in rural communities, some 3.5 billion people. In poor countries, the urban population is expected to double over the next 40 years, going from 2.6 to 5.2 billion. That trend is most pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa. United Nations demographers project that by 2015, that region alone will be the most densely populated corner of the planet. 2 out of 3 Africans are under the age of 25, roughly twice that of Europe. Most Africans still live in rural areas, but that too is changing. In 1960, there was only one city over 1 million people in Africa, Johannesburg. Now there are 40 megacities. And by 2030, the UN estimates most Africans will live in cities. That same kind of demographic imbalance is also present in the United States, particularly with distinct populations. American Indians, for example, are an example of the micro-trend. The median age in the United States is 43, that is, half the population is older and half is younger. But that number is rising every year. Indian country, on the other hand, has a median age of 30, and about 30% of American Indians and Alaska Natives are younger than 18, while only 8% are older than 65. It seems to me that the solution to this sort of demographic imbalance would be to radically increase educational opportunities. We need a smaller population that works smarter. Unfortunately, we're doing the opposite. We're saddling our young people with the greatest debt load in the history of the world, already at about $1 trillion. Instead of investing in young people, we need to carry an older population, we're adding an unsustainable burden to their lives. The housing market is a great example of where the demographics show the why of less. The number of young people buying homes, and for that matter cars, is declining because of that student debt. Unlike other forms of credit, student debt is a permanent drag. These loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, and recent college graduates now carry an average of $25,000 per person. So how does a civil society respond to this crisis? Politicians rally their supporters to protect automatic spending programs for older Americans, such as Medicare and Medicaid, while at the same time raising the cost for young people to attend college. So young people borrow more money, guaranteeing their entry into a world of less, where they will not be able to buy a home for many years. What's striking to me about this trend is that it goes across professional boundaries. I've talked to young doctors and dentists who owe several $100,000 in student loans. This debt limits their decisions about what they will do for a living, pushing these professionals into the most lucrative corners of their practice. Forget public health. Without a generous debt forgiveness program, or even a general practice, the contract is being written by the debt load for doctors who must be specialists because they can earn high fees and pay off those loans. This young person's debt crisis is far more serious than what is owed to the bondholders by the United States of America. Sure, the federal government, or all governments for that matter, might need to cut spending in some areas, but it's far more important for us to focus on our investments and seek solutions that resolve this great demographic imbalance. These trends, as different as they are, represent an opportunity. The population that are growing could be a new economic foundation. So let me turn to the other challenge, climate change. You can call it global warming, climate shock, climate justice, or pick any string of two words that mean the same thing, and immediately you will find they stir deep ideological divisions. But like the new demographic order, the actual impact of climate change has already started and is picking up speed. Last year, in December, I was on the Bering Sea. People there told me about how frozen it used to be. Much is the same for permafrost across the north. One village in Alaska, Newtok, has already had to relocate because of flooding, and another 12 are now considering a move, while another 200 villages are threatened by flooding. This is where the impact of climate change gets tricky. At the same moment the problem is most pronounced, governments effectively lack the resources to pay for solutions. A new report from the nonprofit State Budget Solutions estimates that state debt now tops $4 trillion. Those villages that move first in Alaska will be the lucky ones. But what happens to those who come later when governments can no longer afford expensive relocation? And once again, Africa is of particular concern. Some 250 million people live in low-lying areas with a rising sea level. Only about 1% of Africa's land is located in these low-lying coastal zones, but that land supports 12% of the continent's population. Even more problematic, the majority of Africans live in lower altitudes where the worst effects of hottest temperatures, water scarcity, and longer dry seasons are expected to occur. A few weeks ago, while I was at Bellagio, there was an international conference on Africa and climate change. A science minister from Kenya told me that unlike the rest of the world, these issues were no longer theoretical, but immediate and critical problems. Let's pull back for a minute and think of both of these issues as stories. One story told in our political discourse is about a tiny slice of what we call immigration. If there is climate displacement on a massive scale, how will the United States respond? Will we even be able to say anything, be able to say no, if the human tragedy is beyond anything we now expect? A 2009 report by the International Organization for Migration estimates the numbers ranging impacted that would be required to move in climate change range from 200 million on the low side to 1 million migrants from climate change alone. That's by 2050. That report said environmental drivers of migration are often coupled with economic, social, and development factors that only accelerate and extent mask the impact of climate change. Now, as these two challenges are also challenges for storytelling, journalism, unfortunately, hasn't done a great job with either of these stories. There is a lot of data, a lot of academic reports, and even global policy reviews and papers, but it hasn't been distilled into a journalism narrative. Most of the reporting on demographics, for example, focuses on the national debt, and it ends with numbers. My point is that so much of what we think of as a political debate about our political ideology or the size of the government or even sustainability comes down to how we think about demographics and our future and what changes we're willing to make. The current era, the one defines what I call the era of contraction, misses this very point. The debate focuses on the massive debts of the United States, rather even though that it's part of a larger global issue, not just an American one. A friend of mine, Diane Lim Rogers, who is chief economist for the House Budget Committee and now working at the Concord Coalition, points out that even if we had some kind of magic wand and erased all of our debts today, we would still have a sustainability problem. She writes in her blog, "Our debt would start accumulating immediately because the dynamics of the outlook would still be all wrong. Promised entitlement benefits would still be growing too fast for the economy and revenues to keep up with it. While without any debt, we'd eliminate about $200 billion in net interest. The rest would be mandatory spending, would still use up nearly all of our revenue. So even if we zeroed out the debt clock, we would have an immediately large deficit right away. Starting back the debt clock back up again, and the new debt would be immediately projected to grow faster than GDP, the very definition of unsustainable fiscal outlet." But sustainability is not our defining discourse. Instead, the debate is largely on the margins, focusing on domestic federal programs. The developing story is one of severe austerity in our future. That said, there is a developing master narrative underway, one that I am surprised by, and that is the dystopian genre. Dystopian novels and now movies are hot, hot, hot. A bookstore owner in Toronto recently told Maclean's magazine that this all makes sense. She recalled reading Fahrenheit 451 in the 1960s when Detroit was burning. So now she asks, do you think there might be a renewed interest in dystopia, that it just might reflect the times? Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games trilogy is the most popular dystopian series in 50 years, and the number of dystopian-themed books is at their highest since 1960. The Hunger Games is now on pace to replace 1984 as the most popular dystopian novel ever. And the movie version set a record for a non-sequel with its March 23rd opening day with some $68 million in ticket sales. This dystopian narrative is driven by young people, and it works because it matches the challenges that they know they face. But what makes the dystopian literature useful is that it also has a future that's optimistic. It can be dark and cruel, but in the end, one of the themes of this genre remains hopeful about the outcome. Perhaps that hope is a narrative we can build on. Once again, think about how Africa fits into this global story. The World Bank reported just a few weeks ago that poverty rates are declining across the continent. They use the measure of people living on less than $1.25 a day. That measure, the percentage of poor Africans fell from 58% in 1999 to 47% in 2008. This rate of decline is about 1 percentage point per year, and it's a welcome change from the decade when growth was much slower and the poverty rate increased. But there's actually more to it. The World Bank says in the past, even when poverty rates fell, we typically found that the absolute number of poor people rose because of rapid population growth. But between 2005 and 2008, for the first time, the absolute number of poor people also declined from 395 million to 386 million. 9 million Africans, about the same size as the city of Berlin, escaped poverty during 3 years. Similar numbers are being reported for individual countries. In a survey of the 18 fastest growing African countries, poverty fell in almost all of them. Or here in this country, there's a renewed interest and a zeal in new kinds of solutions involving less. Portland's Get Around is an interesting example of that kind of thinking. The second most expensive asset that most people have in their house is a car. And what does a car do? It sits there most of the day because you don't have time to use it. So in Portland, first in San Francisco and Portland and soon Seattle, folks got together and said, what if you could rent that car out to people throughout the day? And they set an infrastructure to make it so. The growth of this little company sharing a car, allowing people that you don't know to rent it and to go through a central bank has been phenomenal. They have more cars than they can use and more clients that are accessing those cars. And so far, the situation has worked really well. The company is called Get Around in Portland. Our challenge is to move into this wheel of the spoke of less and then to tell that story. Once there, we can redefine success so that it's not just about more. Perhaps our children won't have all the money we had, the huge homes, or the powerful cars. But what if this generation grows more of their own food, walks or bikes, and successfully navigates a changing climate? After all, we all have stories in our families and in our communities about both scarcity and survival. It's those stories we need to remember and tap in order to do what's required. If my grandmother can go from a youthful spendthrift to a frugal elder in a lifetime, there's no reason why I can't navigate the reverse. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Mark, just a week ago, we heard from two speakers at the Bora Symposium who were talking about food sustainability and global agriculture. Does your book include an opportunity to address whether we'll be eating less as well as getting by on less, and what is the diet going to look like on a planet with a bigger population and a younger population and a population that may not have access to some of the same coastal resources that we do today?
This is actually a question I've been really wrestling with, and it's very difficult for me to even think about this as a Westerner, but the fact is we cannot support the consumption of meat in any sustainable fashion the way we've been doing it. There's just no way to make the numbers add up. One of the things that really struck me about Europe is how rare people eat meat. You'll go in a week and maybe only have 3 meals with a meat plate. And it's just become so much of our culture in America where we don't even think about that. But there really is no way to make that work. I say it's been a personal thing that I've been wrestling with because at what point does the ethic require you to make sacrifices that you don't want to make? But it's one I've been thinking a lot. One part of that, though, is I think we can, again, strategically invest in what people do on their own. If we could cut, there's a great study from one of the health journals, and I forget which one, but it's basically said that when people have access to fresh food and vegetables, and they're really easy to have those access, their fresh fruit and vegetable consumption goes up. So you have so many places in the United States that just don't sell it. And so if you had, let's say in public housing as an example, What if every public housing unit required a greenhouse to be included in the project, and it was in the kitchen window where you could have access to it and stuff? Would that increase vegetable consumption by 1%, 2%? And what would that do kind of the overall number? I've been actually talking to some folks at home about kind of a greenhouse project where you could build it and get it into people's houses and just see how they're used. In Italy, greenhouses are everywhere. And it's just, you don't drive very far at all before you see every house has some sort of access to fresh food, fresh vegetables. So I think one of the things that I've been, actually I spoke to a group of Pueblos last week, and I said every tribal council should have a food policy. And I think really every government should have a food policy and think through not just health, but what the food consumption policy is and how to get there. Mm-hmm. It's got to be a success based on sustainability rather than just aggregation. And we just can't simply, I mean, the amount of resources in the world are finite, and we're a shrinking population essentially. I mean, we're not quite there, we're still growing slightly. But if you take Western Europe is actually shrinking, and compare that to places in the world that are growing like Africa, and just there's no way to do both. Somebody has to give up something. Yeah.
In a Western world that's so consumed by getting more and more, how do you think people would really be able to turn that around into something that would be more feasible and more practical for the future? Is that really possible, I guess?
I think it's possible because we're not going to have a choice. If you look at just the amount of tax revenue required to sustain the elder population that includes my group, we would have to raise taxes 300% in order to do that. And that's a seed for a revolution. It's just not going to happen. And more than that, this is just the smallest youth population in American history, and not quite, but almost. And that just can't support a population that's 3 times its size. One person working cannot support 3 people not working. Yeah.
You going back to the first question that was asked, you were talking about sustainable food practices and feeding. But in a world where job rates are low and family incomes are declining, should the public be demanding more from their local governments, or demanding more from educational systems so they can provide themselves the opportunities to gain access to these foods that will help our consumption go down and thus gain us to live a more sustainable life? Do you agree? Or how do you feel about what do you think the public should do?
Yeah, I didn't talk about it tonight, but one of the chapters I'm working on is about how our governance system is unable to deal with some of these chronic issues. And part of it, I think, is rethinking governance in a way that allows people to get in to have a sustainable discussion. We have a lot of peculiar functions in our nature of our democracy, but one of those is the way that it pits folks on opposite sides and allows things to become debates of rhetoric rather than get into the real issues. And so somehow we've got to get beyond that, and I think that's part of demanding sustainable practices. I mean, there's a group in Seattle that I'm actually on the board of called Sightline that has a project called Make Sustainability Legal, and they've been going through different community laws and looking for practices that thwart sustainability and then trying to get them reversed. For example, with the growth of condo associations and real estate groups, It's illegal in many cities to hang your clothes out. And so you're required to use a dryer. And so they've been trying to get those kind of laws reversed so that people can use more sustainable practices in every day. Yes?
In terms of improving our energy efficiency and using less in the future, do you have any ideas of what the most viable alternative energy solutions could be? Not just in the U.S., but
No, I think there are a lot of different options in that regard. And I think even if we wanted to stick with oil and gas, again, looking to Western Europe, every vehicle is so much smaller that it automatically consumes less. But more than that, public transportation is so widespread that people don't even think of driving. I had, being a good American, drove a van around Italy with my family, and there were 7 of us in it, so we thought it was cost efficient. But to fill a tank of gas in that van was about 180 euros. So you feel it every time. And policy gets down to when you look at that credit card receipt. So, and as gas goes above $4 a gallon, $5 a gallon, you'll start seeing that same sort of thinking in the United States where people just automatically start looking for ways. Every time gas passes a certain point, bus ridership goes up in urban areas because people find it more efficient to get around that way.
So Mark, since so many of the audience tonight are journalists or related field, can you give some examples of journalists or publications or websites that have adapted to these 2 new narratives? So somebody doing some insightful reporting either on the demographic revolution or on new reality of climate change.
I'd say climate change is probably ahead of demographic reality because there's just so many more. It's moving from a story of theory to one of practice. The move of the Quileutes in Washington State this year off the coast, I mean, that's just something that's pretty easy to understand. I think with demographics, it's one of the problems of journalism is we do a great job of focusing on breaking stories and things that are happening in front of us, but we do less of a great job of pulling back. We do great about writing about trees, but less so when it comes to writing about the forest. And this is a forest story. You need to pull back and ideally look at it from space. I mean, it's that far away, distant story. Yes?
you were talking about the new dystopian worldview that's kind of coming back to kind of a popular ideology. Is it really a good thing that that's becoming popular? Because in the dystopian viewpoint, it's almost, it got so bad that it's after when it really hit that wall, and it's kind of, we have hope now that that problem has happened.
Right.
Is that necessarily good to be kind of putting that as kind of a myth, or, you know, the hope of after this happens? Shouldn't we be more concerned about what we can do now than we should really be concerned about, you know, a later narrative of hope after the issue?
That's a great question. I guess let me start by just saying how I view master narratives. Master narratives are kind of like human software, that they run in our background systems and we don't even think about them, but we recognize the story when we hear it. And dystopia is a story we recognize, and we get that things could get so bad that everything would break down. If you try to write a story about muddle, about how if we do this and this and this, we could save ourselves from that dystopian future, it doesn't connect. And so I think the problem for a storyteller is by just getting it out, you have to somehow tap into this narrative and then twist it and try to get people to think, but if you do it now, you don't have to get that. So I think that's where you kind of rely on that genre. I mean, it really is an open question. I mean, we have some really serious, hard issues. If we're lucky and Africa continues on the trajectory it's on, things could turn out pretty good. I mean, it would be a good outcome. But if those numbers turn south and you have a third, I mean, just because of the staggering number of numbers, you could have a situation of unparalleled misery. One of the odd things is there are two things happening in Africa, I think, that make that kind of story resonate. One is the way women are influencing agriculture. You're seeing a lot more farms in rural areas run by women. In Kenya, for example, I was talking to a friend of mine, and the way the land laws work, if the young women get married and anything happens, they lose their farm. So more of them are choosing as a lifestyle to stay single and have children so they can carry the property rights. And women tend to farm in Africa differently than men. They tend to be much more about self-sustaining their family, their community, keeping the crops local so they don't have transportation issues, whereas men see it as a revenue source and a way to generate. And so that trend has been really productive. But like I say, if things go south, that story could change really rapidly. Right now, it's a good news story. So, I mean, you hope that it's not the outcome in any of those narrative stories. And maybe just by having them out there, it gets people to think about the possible. I mean, you look at the times when dystopia genres are popular, and it's usually when something else is going on in society. The 1960s were all Cold War related, and the themes in the books were very much Cold War related.
One of the earlier questioners asked about the difficulty of government to deal with these issues. I'm wondering, are you hearing anything at all encouraging on the campaign trail from presidential candidates or from President Obama himself? Anybody acknowledging any of these issues in a way that offer some hope for solutions?
No, I think both are committed to austerity, and by doing that, they've taken the side, and I say this as an older person, but they've taken the side of the older population against the younger population. And I think we're going to have to reach the point where we get beyond that and say, particularly to the older generation, that if we don't invest serious money in education now, you think the problems of supporting this large population, I forget the latest numbers, but it's like every 50 seconds someone is turning 50. It's just this incredible surge. And we're living a long time too. It's not just that we're 50, but a baby born today has a 50-50 chance of 100. Yes?
Do you see religious stories shifting in a way that will have an impact on population and sustainability?
Not yet. In fact, religion's kind of on the other side of this issue, particularly in the developing world. One of those odd, counterintuitive ideas is that the more that public health officials can do to increase survivability of an infant in its first year or two, the population drops. And so you would think that religion would say this is a good thing, let's invest in trying to help people get that child to survive in the first year of life. And instead it gets into contraception and a lot of the other issues. When the population is large, when poor people in Africa, for example, feel like they have to have 6 or 7 or 8 kids because they need 30% of them to survive, that's when you see these population booms that are unsustainable. And so that's where religion plays a big role, particularly in the developing world, is trying to figure out how to harness sustainable life in terms of the family. I think that's an important story, though, because how religion communicates values in a time of change is One of the things that I became obsessed with, some would say, in Italy is Sibyls. Has anyone heard of Sibyls? Sibyls were prophets and were really common, particularly in the Greek culture and in early Jewish culture. And so much so that by the time of Rome, they were incorporated into the power structure, and recordings of the Sibyls were, the Senate had control of them, and the Senate wanted to know exactly what was in those prophecies. They were under lock and key, and only the Senate could release that information. When Christianity started, at first the Catholic Church embraced the whole idea of Sibyls with fanfare. In fact, there were first 9, then 10 Sibyls, and then in early Christianity they boosted the number to 12, so there would be 12 Sibyls and 12 apostles, and a balance between male and female. And when the Council of Trent came along, they decided that the world would be better off without Sibyls. And so they ordered churches to get rid of statues of Sibyls and art of Sibyls. And in Lugano, Switzerland, one of the places that's very near Lake Como, there's this room full of Sibyls. And they were like women with swords, and they were doing all these things. And it just sparked this curiosity. And so for the next 3 weeks in Italy, I was just bugging everybody about, what do you know about Sibyls? But those are the kind of stories that I think if we can get back to the roots, you might be able to bring back and say there's a broader context. And that religion goes through these same sorts of storytelling changes, and it has throughout pretty much every church's history. So you can draw on those older stories maybe to help explain what's happening today. That's a hope anyway. Okay, thank you.